All right, so this is 3A number 2, which is simplifying powers of I. Let's get into it. So, before I get further into this, let's just think about this. Anytime I is equivalent to square root of negative 1. So if we square I, so if you square it on the left side, you square it on the right side, you hopefully will see that the square root and square, those are opposite operations, which would simplify those out. So I squared is equivalent to negative 1. Keep that in mind. That's what we're looking for when we're simplifying I to any power, because negative 1 is easy to work with. It's an easy number to work with, easy to simplify. So I to the fourth. Think about how many I squareds can you divide out of I to the fourth. So think of it this way. 4 divided by 2 is 2. So you're going to have I squared on the inside, because we're dividing by 2, the exponent 2, and then we'll have a 2 on the outside. So 4 divided by 2 is 2. The 2 goes on the outside. The reason why we're dividing by 2 is because we're looking at I squareds. Remember, I squared. I squared then is equivalent to negative 1. So I'm going to read what is in parentheses. I'm going to change that to negative 1. And negative 1 squared, so square just comes down. Negative 1 squared is negative 1 times negative 1, which is positive 1. So I to the fourth is positive 1. Number 2, think about how many squares can you divide out of 10? Should be saying 5. So we're saying I squared times 5 to the 5th power is I to the 10th. Well, let's look at, maybe I'll just do it down below. I squared is negative 1. Negative 1 to the 5th power. You could write this out if you'd like, if that helps you to start. Eventually, writing it out might not work out so well. It will, but it's going to take a long time. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. Times negative 1 times negative 1 is negative 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. Positive 1 times negative 1 is negative 1. Wow, that's quite a rodeo. Or you could think a negative number to an odd power is always going to be negative. It's negative 1. All right. So that was number 1 and number 2 is even powers. So let's look at odd powers. So it's odd. So your first step is always divided by 2. So how many pairs can you take out of 11? I squared. Well, 11 divided by 2 is 5.5. We don't want decimals. We want, what's the biggest number you can divide out of 11 evenly? Divide by 2. Well, that's 10. 10 divided by 2 is 5. But now we look, 2 times 5 is only 10. We need 11. So what you're going to do is you're actually going to multiply here by another I. Because I, that power is 1. So we have 2 times 5 is 10. Plus 1 more is 11. The reason why we're adding is because it's multiplying like bases. So that's 11 i's now. So I to the 11th. So now let's look what we can simplify. I squared, that's always your next step. Convert that to negative 1 to the 5th times I. Negative 1 to the 5th power, we just worked that out. And negative 1 to odd power is negative 1 times I. Negative 1 times I, treat it just like a variable, I. Negative 1 times I is negative I. That's your answer. I to the 24th. So divide that by 2. That's 12. 2 times 12 is 24, so that works out. These are equivalent. Those are equivalent right there. And convert I squared to negative 1. Negative 1 to the 12th. So now it's to even power. You can write it all out. But negative 1 to even power is always going to be a positive number. So it's positive 1. All right, number 5. All right, we're going to take that negative 5 and we're going to put it off to the side. We're going to work on, the thing we need to simplify is I to the 33rd. How many squares can you divide out of 33? Not evenly, but you can divide 16 out. 2 times 16 is 32. We need 33. So what we do is we multiply by one more I to get 33 i's total. And then I squared is negative 1. Negative 1 to the 16th power is positive 1. And 1 times I is I. Don't forget about that pesky 5, negative 5 there. That's got to come down. Negative 5i, there's nothing to simplify there, so that's your final answer. All right, number 6, we have a negative exponent. Negative exponent, what that needs to do is you take the base of the exponent and the exponent and drop it to the denominator. So we're going to drop it into a denominator, make it positive 4. Now you're like, well, there's nothing in the numerator. Well, there's always something there. There's always that 1. So it's 1 over I to the positive 4. So now we have I to the 4th. Let's look at I to the 4th. How many I squareds can you divide out of 4? 2. I squared is negative 1. Squared, negative 1 squared is positive 1. So that denominator is positive 1. And 1 divided by 1 is 1. Cool. So the next one's very similar. We've got a negative exponent. You're going to take the base, which is I, and the exponent, and move it all down to the denominator and make the exponent positive. Now let's simplify I to the 25th. So I'm just going to work in the denominator. Represented as I squared. How many squares can divide out of 25? 12. 2 times 12 is 24. We need 25, so let's multiply by one more I there. In the denominator, let's keep simplifying. Our next step after we break down the i's, we have I squared is negative 1 to the 12th times I. Next step is negative 1 to the 12th. It's the even power. So negative 1 to the 12th is a positive 1. 1 times I. I didn't have to put in parentheses, but I did. 1 times I is I. 1 divided by I is your final answer. Or if you really want to write it without a fraction, you could write it like this to the negative 1. So you can bring it back up into the exponent. No fraction then. All right, number 8. It looks very similar to number 7, but there's no negative on the exponent. The thing with this negative here, what I would have you do, think of it as like it's negative 1 times I to the 67th. You don't have to do that, but a lot of times that helps students keep things straight. So I'm just going to look at the i's. So that negative has nothing to do with the I right now. So we're not going to do anything with it to simplify. Oop, not 67. I squared, how many squares can divide out of 67? Well, let's go to 66, which is 33. 2 times 33 is 66. We need 67, so let's multiply by one more I. So then that gives us up to 67. Negative 1 just keeps coming down. I squared, I just convert that to negative 1. And the negative 1 to the to the 33rd power is going to be negative 1. And negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. Positive 1 times I is I. Boom. Positive I. All right, moving on. Each one of these we need to simplify. And we need to figure out which one is equivalent to I. So we need to figure out which one's equivalent to I. We just got to work each one out. So first one, how many squares can divide out of 10? 5. Negative 1 to the 5th, that's negative 1. So nope, that's not I. I to the 60th, how many I squareds can divide out of 60? 30. I squared is negative 1 to the 30th. What is that? Positive 1. That's not I. That's not equivalent. So negative 1 here, let's do this in green. Negative 1 times I squared to the 15th. I squared is negative 1. Negative 1 to the 15th is negative 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. Well, Doesn't matter. Any which way, that's not equivalent to I. So that's not an answer. Notice those first three are even powers. They are never going to be I or negative I. Odd powers like 105 here can be. So let's see here. We have I squared. How many squares can divide out of 105? That's 52. That's 104 times one more I. That's 105. I squared is negative 1. Negative 1 to the 52nd is a positive 1. 1 times I is I. Yes, there's an answer. I to the negative 24th. So that's 1 over I to the positive 24. 1 over I squared. How many squares can divide out of 24? 12. And I squared is negative 1 to the 12th is positive 1. 1 divided by 1 is 1. Great answer, just not for an answer choice here. And the last one, negative 1 times I is just negative I, which is not I. So only one answer here. There can be more than one. All right, next, let's move on to 10. What are we looking at? Equivalent to 1. I to the 64th. So I squared, 32, and negative 1 to the 32nd. That is positive 1. Cool, that's an answer. Odd powers can never be positive 1 or negative 1. Reason why, I'll show you right here. So it's 26. Because you have to multiply by this extra I here, the first part is always going to be positive 1 or negative 1. And when you multiply that by I, there's no way to possibly ever get a positive 1 or a negative 1. So anytime you see a negative x or a odd exponent, it's not going to work to be positive 1 or negative 1. But I'll keep working this out just for practice. Negative 1 to 26 is 1 times I is I. So it's I, not quite. Next one, negative 1 times I to the 32nd. Negative 1 I squared, sorry for that, to the 16th. Negative 1 times negative 1 to the 16th. Negative 1 to the 16th is positive 1. Positive 1 times negative 1 is negative 1. That's not that. I squared is negative 1. That's not right. I to the negative 2. So that's 1 over I squared. 1 over I squared is negative 1. 1 divided by negative 1 is still negative 1. That's not right. Last one, negative 1 times I squared. I squared is negative 1, so negative 1 times negative 1. Well, that is positive 1. So that's good. So that one we have 2 answers, first and last. Equivalent to negative 1. All right, so number 11, I squared to the 7th. Negative 1 to the 7th, that is negative 1. Cool, that's an answer. I squared to the 28th. Negative 1 to the 28th is a positive 1. That's not an answer. It's not equivalent. Negative 1 times I squared to the 8th. It's negative 1 on the outside times negative 1. Got to do it to the 8th power, which is positive 1. And negative 1 times positive 1 is negative 1. That's an answer. I to the 300. 150. Negative 1 to the 150 is positive 1. So that's not an answer. I to the 1 over 24. I squared to the 12th, which is negative 1 to the 12th. Negative 1 to the 12th is positive 1, so that's 1. We want negative 1, not the answer. And the last one is already simplified. No, that's not an answer. So there's 2 answers there. And lastly, negative I. I to the 0. Anything to the 0 power is always positive 1, no matter what. Any number, any letter, anything. to the 0 power is 1. Next one, we have I squared. How many divide out of 17? That should be 8, but 2 times 8 is 16, so you have to multiply by 1 more I to get 17 i's total. I squared is negative 1. Negative 1 to the 8th is positive 1. 1 times I is I. That's not right. We need negative I. Negative 1 times I squared. Oh, that's ugly. To the 14th. Negative 1 to the 14th. You can already see this is not going to be equivalent to I because there's no i's left. Negative 1. Not working. I to the I squared to the 1. Nope. 51. Yep. That's 102. We need 1 more I for 103. I squared is negative 1 to the 51st times I. This is looking pretty good. I to the negative or positive 51 is negative 1 times I is negative I. Cool. That's an answer. Oh boy, we're getting crazy here. All right. So we have 1 over 30. 1 over I to the 37th. And I guess we can do it, let's do it this way. This might make more sense. Times I to the negative 24th. Let's move that so it's in the denominator. Right now it's in the numerator. And let's simplify this. We can do it separately if you'd like. I to the 37th is 1 over I squared to the 18th times I. And let's do the 24th while we're at it. I squared to the 12th. The first one is, I'm just going to rewrite the I squared with negative 1. A lot easier to look at negative 1 than I squared. And negative 1 to the 12th. And the first one, negative 1 to the 18th, is positive 1. 1 divided by, or positive 1. That's positive 1 times I is I. Second one, negative 1 to the 12th is positive 1. So we have 1 divided by 1 is 1 times 1 over I. Well, that's not negative I, so no. And the last one. Let's do it up top. Negative 1 times I. How many I squareds go into 23? 11. That's 22. Need 1 more for 23. I squared is negative 1. Negative 1 to the 11th is negative 1. So we have negative 1 times negative 1 times I. That's positive 1 times I is I. We're looking for negative I. Bummer. Looks like we only got one answer there. All right. Come with any questions to class. I know that was a lot of work, but hopefully it really pays off. Thank you.